Imagine sitting in a luxurious bar, sipping your favorite drink, when suddenly, you witness something that makes your blood boil. A wealthy VIP, drunk on power, harassing a young bartender while the manager looks the other way. But what no one knows is that the quiet man in the corner isn't just another customer. He owns the place, and tonight, he's not staying silent. The low hum of jazz music blended with the quiet clinking of ice against crystal glasses, wrapping the bar in an air of effortless luxury. Soft, golden lighting reflected off the polished marble countertops, casting elongated shadows across the velvet booths. Vera Lux wasn't just a bar. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where the rich could slip away from the world outside and indulge in exclusivity. Ethan Carter sat alone in a dimly lit corner of the VIP section, a whiskey glass resting between his fingers. He had designed Vera Lux to be impenetrable, a fortress of indulgence that catered to the wealthiest of New York's elite. But tonight, something felt off. Across the room, Richard Vaughn lounged at the bar with the lazy arrogance of a man who had never been told no. A hedge fund titan with more power than conscience, he exuded an air of untouchability, his hand draped possessively over Sophie Martinez's wrist, his grip tightening as she attempted to step back. "Come on," Richard drawled, voice thick with liquor and entitlement. "Just one drink with me. What's the harm?" Sophie, ever the professional, kept her expression neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her discomfort. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I have other customers to attend to." Richard chuckled, as if she had just told a joke meant to amuse him. "Oh, I think they can wait." His fingers brushed the fabric of her sleeve, a casual movement that sent an unmistakable message. From his seat, Ethan's grip on his glass tightened. He had seen situations like this play out before, powerful men acting as though everything and everyone in this bar existed for their entertainment. It was an ugly truth that he had learned to ignore, telling himself that Vera Lux was a business, not a battleground for morality. But tonight, something about it sat differently. Sophie's eyes darted toward Mark Sullivan, the bar's manager, a silent plea, but Mark barely glanced up from the tablet in his hands. "Just go along with it," he murmured under his breath, not bothering to meet her gaze. "He's an important guest. You don't want to make a scene, do you?" Sophie swallowed, her jaw tightening. For a brief moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, but then her shoulders dropped, the fight slipping away as she turned back to Richard with a forced smile. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the exchange with cold calculation. It wasn't just Richard's behavior that unsettled him, it was Mark's reaction. The indifference, the quiet expectation that Sophie would endure this, as if it were part of the job. He had built this empire, and yet, sitting in the very heart of it, he was witnessing something rot beneath the surface. A sudden motion pulled him from his thoughts. Sophie had tried to step away again, but Richard's grip tightened, jerking her backward. The movement sent a cocktail glass tumbling from the counter, crashing against the floor in a spray of shattered glass and golden liquid. The entire bar seemed to still for a fraction of a second. Ethan's fingers curled around the cool glass of his whiskey, the tension in his jaw hardening. Tonight, he would not let this go. The city was still alive outside, but inside Ethan Carter's penthouse, there was only silence. He had barely spoken a word since leaving Vera Lux, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing against his thoughts. He poured himself a drink and sat at his desk, but the whiskey tasted flat, its warmth unable to dull the unease creeping into his mind. He powered on his laptop and logged into the private security system that monitored every one of his establishments. The interface was sleek and efficient, a testament to the order he had built within his empire. But tonight, that sense of control felt like an illusion. Ethan pulled up the footage from earlier that evening, rewinding to the moment Richard Vaughn reached for Sophie Martinez's wrist. He leaned forward, watching as she flinched, clearly uncomfortable, yet forced to maintain composure. He fast-forwarded, tracking her desperate glance toward Mark Sullivan. Then came the part that turned Ethan's stomach. Mark barely looked up from his tablet before waving her off, dismissing her with a quiet remark. Moments later, when Sophie finally pulled away and walked toward the back, Mark turned to Richard and let out a small chuckle. The two exchanged a few words, and then, as if nothing had happened, the night continued. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. He opened a separate database. Scrolling through past complaints. His bars and clubs operated under strict guidelines. He had always believed in running a business that was both profitable and well managed. But the further he looked, the clearer it became that something had been slipping through the cracks. Dozens of flagged incidents appeared in the logs, most of them marked as resolved, with no further details. Sophie wasn't the first. Ethan clicked on one of the older cases. A report from 6 months ago. The name of the complainant caught his eye, Emily Chen. He vaguely remembered her as a former bartender. But according to the system, she had left, voluntarily. He opened the file and saw the attached notes. Allegations of inappropriate behavior by a guest. No corrective action taken. Employee chose to resign after expressing discomfort with management's handling of the situation. He checked another case, then another. The same pattern. Ethan's fingers curled into a fist against the desk. This wasn't just an oversight. Someone had been ensuring these reports never saw the light of day. His mind returned to Mark Sullivan. The way he had brushed off Sophie. The casual ease with which he had laughed with Richard. Mark wasn't incompetent. He was complicit. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to temper the frustration rising inside him. This wasn't just about one incident or one employee. It was systemic. If Mark had been covering up these issues at Vera Lux, who was to say it wasn't happening at his other locations? He tapped his fingers against the desk. Considering his next move, this wasn't something he could fix with a single conversation. He needed to go deeper, to understand the full scope of what was happening under his own roof. One thing was certain, this went beyond Mark. Ethan made a decision. Tomorrow, he would walk through the doors of Vera Lux not as a silent observer, but as its CEO. But as he shut his laptop and leaned back in his chair, he remained unaware of what was already happening behind the scenes. Somewhere across the city, Mark Sullivan had received a message, a quiet warning that someone had been watching. By morning, Ethan wouldn't be the only one coming prepared. Morning light filtered through the tinted windows of Vera Lux, casting long shadows on the polished floors. The bar had a different air during the daytime, without the dim lighting and heavy jazz. It felt almost clinical. Ethan Carter stepped through the front entrance, his presence sending a quiet ripple through the staff. Most of them had never seen him in person. Some recognized him from company memos or articles in business magazines. Others only knew the name, the reputation. Mark Sullivan looked up from behind the bar, his expression freezing for a fraction of a second before smoothing into something neutral. He wiped his hands on a towel, then forced a polite smile. "Well, this is a surprise," Mark said, keeping his tone light. "Didn't think I'd see you here before sunset." Ethan returned a small nod, neither confirming nor denying anything. "I figured it was time to check in, see how things are running firsthand." Mark chuckled, but the sound lacked any real amusement. "Things are running just fine. As always." Ethan said nothing. His gaze swept the room, noting small details. How the bartender on duty stiffened when she caught sight of him. How two waiters exchanged a glance before quickly returning to their tasks. There was tension beneath the surface, a kind of unease that went beyond the typical nerves of employees in the presence of their boss. "Good," Ethan finally said. "Let's see how the staff is doing." Then, he let the words hang there, watching as Mark's fingers tightened slightly around the towel in his hands. The office was a stark contrast to the luxury outside. A simple desk, a few filing cabinets, and a small leather couch. Sophie Martinez sat on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tense, her eyes flicking toward the door as if weighing whether she had made a mistake by agreeing to this meeting. Ethan leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice steady. "I appreciate you taking the time to talk. I know last night was difficult." Sophie hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Ethan said without hesitation. "You're not." She let out a slow breath but still didn't fully relax. "I wanted to ask about what happened," Ethan continued. "Not just last night, but if this kind of thing has happened before." Sophie hesitated again. Then, slowly, she pressed her palms together, as if trying to warm herself. "It happens more than people realize," she admitted. "Not just to me, to a lot of the women who work here." Ethan didn't interrupt. He let her talk, knowing that silence was sometimes the best way to draw out the truth. Most of the time, we just deal with it, she said. You learn which customers to avoid, how to steer the conversation away before things get worse. But sometimes, it doesn't matter, and when we try to speak up, Mark makes it clear we're the problem. Ethan's jaw tightened. What do you mean? Sophie wet her lips, then said carefully, I mean Mark never does anything about it. And if you push too hard, if you make a real complaint, you don't stay here long. A cold sensation settled in Ethan's chest. Has that happened before? Sophie nodded slowly. Emily Chen. She used to work here. One of the best bartenders we had. She didn't just take it. She pushed back, complained, and a week later, she was gone. She quit? That's what they told us. But no one believed it. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his mind already racing ahead. Do you know where she is now? Sophie hesitated. I think she works at a small place in Brooklyn. But I don't know if she'll talk. That's my problem to figure out, Ethan said. Back in his office, Ethan pulled up the employee records for Emily Chen. Her file was thin, too thin. The official reason for her termination was vague, violation of company policy, without any supporting documentation. That wasn't standard procedure. He switched to the internal email database, running a search for any correspondence related to her. It didn't take long before he found something. A message from Mark Sullivan, dated a few days after Emily had been let go. The subject line was innocuous, but one sentence in the body stood out. I've handled the issue. She won't be a problem anymore. Ethan sat back, a slow breath leaving his lips. This wasn't just negligence. This was intentional. He wasn't just dealing with one incident, or even one bad manager. He was staring at a pattern, a system that had been running under his nose for who knew how long. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His head of accounting, Daniel Grant, stepped inside. You asked for financial reports on Vera Lux? Ethan nodded. Tell me if you see anything unusual. Daniel frowned slightly as he flipped through his tablet, scanning the numbers. Then he stopped. His expression darkened. There are direct transfers marked as incentives going to Mark Sullivan. The amounts vary, but they come from a few of our highest spending clients, including Richard Vaughn. Ethan took the tablet, scrolling through the data. The figures weren't astronomical, but they were consistent, small enough not to raise red flags but frequent enough to be deliberate. A slow anger curled in his chest. Mark hadn't just been turning a blind eye. He had been profiting from it. Ethan set the tablet down. This wasn't just about one bar. If Mark had been doing this, there was a real chance other locations had their own arrangements as well. And if that was the case, then this wasn't just a personnel issue. It was a cancer running through his business. He wasn't going to let it spread any further. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, watching as Mark Sullivan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The manager looked composed, but there was something in his stance, his shoulders held just a little too rigidly, his fingers adjusting his cuffs one too many times. He was prepared for this meeting, or at least, he thought he was. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit. Mark settled in, flashing a polite smile. What's on your mind? Ethan folded his hands on the desk. Emily Chen. Mark barely reacted. If anything, he looked amused. That was a while ago. What about her? What happened? Ethan asked, his tone deceptively casual. Mark tilted his head. She had a problem with how things worked around here. She wasn't a good fit. Ethan met his gaze. Be more specific. Mark sighed, shifting slightly. She made a scene with an important client. Completely unprofessional. She refused to play along with how this business operates. So, I made the call. She had to go. Ethan let the silence stretch between them before asking, which client? Mark smirked, shaking his head. I don't recall, but I can guarantee it wasn't anyone worth mentioning. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lowering. That's interesting, because I happen to know you've been receiving performance bonuses directly from certain clients, including Richard Vaughn. For the first time, Mark hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Ethan caught it, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way he exhaled just a little too sharply through his nose. That's not illegal, Mark said, his voice measured. It's just good business. Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer. Then leaned back. That depends on who's defining good business. When Mark left the office, his movements were brisk, his jaw tight. Ethan watched him go, then shifted his attention to the small recording device hidden beneath his desk. He had expected Mark to make a move, and sure enough, not 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed with an alert. Mark had made a call. Ethan tapped into the live feed, listening as Mark's voice came through the hidden microphone in his office. "Yeah, he knows something," Mark muttered. "He's been asking about Emily. And he brought up the payments." A pause. Then another voice came through, low, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to being in control. "Richard Vaughn." "That idiot," Richard said, voice laced with annoyance. "I told you to keep things quiet." "I did," Mark shot back. "But he's digging. We need to deal with this before it becomes a problem." A longer pause. Then Richard's tone hardened. "Take care of it. I'll handle the rest." Ethan exhaled slowly. So that was it. This wasn't just about Mark covering up incidents at Vera Lux. It went higher. Richard Vaughn wasn't just a wealthy client with bad habits. He had influence, power, and, more concerningly, he had a seat at the table, one of the largest shareholders in Ethan's company. Ethan's mind worked quickly, sorting through the implications. If Richard was involved at this level, it meant the corruption wasn't just an isolated problem at Vera Lux. It could be spread across multiple locations. Worse, if Richard suspected Ethan was planning to take action, he could use his leverage in the boardroom to push him out. This wasn't about one bad manager. It was a system, a network, a machine designed to protect itself. Ethan knew he had to be careful. If he acted too soon, Richard could spin the situation, claim that Ethan was overstepping, turn the board against him. If he waited too long, Richard might find a way to bury everything before Ethan could expose him. He needed to be strategic. This wasn't just about cleaning up his business anymore. It was war. Ethan Carter had spent years navigating the world of high-stakes business, where leverage and alliances dictated survival. He knew that if he wanted to take down Richard Vaughn, he couldn't do it alone. Vaughn wasn't just another wealthy investor. He had influence, resources, and connections that stretched beyond Vera Lux. If Ethan made one wrong move, Vaughn could turn the board against him and push him out of his own company before he ever had a chance to fight back. He needed someone with first-hand knowledge, someone who had seen the rot within the system. Emily Chen was his best shot. He found an old employee record with her last known address, a small apartment in Brooklyn. It wasn't much to go on, and he had no idea if she would even agree to talk. But if there was even a chance she had the missing piece he needed, it was a risk worth taking. Ethan reached out to Emily the next morning. He expected hesitation. He didn't expect outright refusal. "I'm not interested," she said, cutting him off before he could explain. He let the silence stretch between them, waiting. People who didn't care wouldn't answer a call from an unknown number. She had picked up. That meant something. "I spoke to Sophie Martinez," he said finally. "I know what happened to you wasn't an accident." There was a pause on the other end. He could hear her breathing, steady but measured. "You don't know anything," she said, but the sharpness in her voice had dulled slightly. "I know Mark Sullivan covered up more than one case. I know employees who reported harassment were either ignored or pushed out. And I know you didn't leave on your own terms." Another silence. This one longer. "I won't talk to you," Emily said, but she didn't hang up. "You don't have to trust me," Ethan said, "just meet with me once. If you think I'm wasting your time, I'll walk away. No questions asked." She sighed. "If this is about protecting your company's image, don't bother." "It's not," Ethan said simply. "I want to change everything." Another pause. Finally, she said, "There's a cafe on Atlantic Avenue. 1 o'clock. Then the line went dead. The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Ethan arrived first, choosing a table near the back. He didn't have to wait long. Emily stepped inside, scanning the room before her gaze landed on him. She was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it was just the weight she carried in her posture. She looked cautious but not scared. She sat down, folding her arms. "Say what you need to say." Ethan didn't waste time. "I want to know what really happened." Emily exhaled. glancing toward the window as if weighing whether this conversation was worth the risk. Then, she spoke. Mark wasn't just ignoring complaints. She said, he was covering for the worst of them. Ethan listened as she laid out everything. The incidents she had reported. The ones she knew about but couldn't prove. The last straw was a customer. Emily continued, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Not Richard Vaughn. Someone else. A guest who went too far. I filed a report, and Mark pulled me aside the next day. Told me I could either sign a resignation letter or deal with the consequences. Ethan's jaw tightened. Did he threaten you? He didn't have to, Emily said. He made it clear that I wouldn't find work anywhere else if I made trouble. Ethan studied her. Do you have proof? She reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. Setting it on the table between them. Before I left, I copied everything I could, emails, security footage, complaints that were deleted from the system. I don't know if it's enough, but it's what I have. Ethan took the drive carefully, feeling the weight of what it represented. This wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. If you use this, you better be ready, Emily warned. People like Richard Vaughn don't just sit back and let their secrets come out. Ethan nodded. I know. As he left the cafe, the cool air hit him like a wake-up call. He gripped the USB drive in his pocket, feeling the shift in the fight ahead. But something else caught his attention. A black sedan was parked across the street, engine idling. The windows were tinted, but Ethan had spent too many years in business to ignore when he was being watched. Richard Vaughn wasn't waiting. He was already moving. Ethan Carter sat in his office, the USB drive resting in his palm like a loaded weapon. He had spent years making calculated decisions, but none had carried this level of risk. He plugged the drive into his laptop, his pulse steady, his mind razor sharp, the screen filled with folders. He clicked through them, scanning the contents. Emily had been thorough. Emails, timestamps, security footage, pieces of a puzzle that painted a damning picture. One email thread between Mark Sullivan and Richard Vaughn stood out. Mark had written, handled the situation. Employee has been removed. No further issues on my end. Richard's response was curt. Good. Make sure it stays that way. Ethan's gaze darkened. Then came the video files. He clicked on one labeled security_feed_original.mp4. A grainy recording played. A bartender backing away from a well-dressed man. She was cornered. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her wrist. The timestamp showed it had happened 6 months ago. He opened another file titled security_feed_modified.mp4. The same footage, but this time, the crucial moment had been erased. The system had been tampered with. Ethan leaned back in his chair. This wasn't negligence. This was a cover-up. He exhaled, closing his laptop. If he played this right, Mark would fall, but Richard Vaughn, he would take a bigger hit. Ethan knew Richard had the power to manipulate public perception, to spin the narrative in his favor. A direct confrontation would be reckless. He needed someone who could control the message. He picked up his phone and dialed. Olivia Reed answered on the second ring. You don't call unless it's big, she said. What do you have? Ethan didn't waste time. Evidence of a cover-up. A high-profile client assaulting employees. Video tampering. Internal emails proving management buried complaints. She was silent for a moment. Then, send it. Not yet, Ethan said. I need this done the right way. If Vaughn sees this coming, he'll discredit everything before the story breaks. Olivia understood the game. She was one of the best investigative journalists in the country. She had taken down corporate fraudsters, exposed corruption, and knew how to handle powerful men who thought they were untouchable. I'll verify it first, she said. Then we control the rollout. Ethan hesitated. Be careful. This isn't just a business scandal. Vaughn plays dirty. I know how to handle men like him, she said. The real question is, do you? Ethan hung up. He had played this game long enough to know that Vaughn wouldn't wait for the first punch to land. He'd throw his own. 2 hours later, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. Emergency board meeting. Tonight. Be there. Ethan's stomach tightened. Vaughn was already making his move. By the time he arrived, the boardroom was full. Richard Vaughn sat at the head of the long table, exuding confidence. He barely acknowledged Ethan as he entered. The chairman cleared his throat. This meeting has been called to address a serious concern. Vaughn finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Ethan Carter has been making decisions that could put this company at risk. He's acting outside his authority, pursuing unfounded accusations that damage our brand. Ethan remained silent, letting the words settle in the room. Vaughn was trying to frame him as reckless, unhinged. I propose a vote, Vaughn continued, to review Ethan Carter's leadership and determine if he remains fit to run this company. Ethan scanned the room. Some board members looked uncomfortable. Others nodded along with Vaughn's words. He knew some of them were under Vaughn's influence. The vote could go either way. He needed time. Before he could speak, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Olivia Reed. We have a problem. Someone wiped everything. The files you sent, they're gone. Ethan kept his face unreadable. But inside, his mind raced. Vaughn had anticipated this. He had people inside the system, erasing the evidence before it could go public. Ethan had played his first move. Vaughn had just countered. The real fight had begun. Ethan Carter stepped into the boardroom, the air thick with expectation. The long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting, the polished surface reflecting the serious expressions of the executives seated around it. Richard Vaughn sat near the head of the table, relaxed, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. The room smelled of leather, coffee, and quiet authority, an arena where power was rarely displayed with raised voices but rather with carefully chosen words. Ethan had known this meeting was coming. Vaughn had moved too quickly after their last encounter for this to be anything but an orchestrated attack. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth and composed. Gentlemen, ladies, I think we can all agree that recent events have been unsettling. There have been rumors, unverified accusations, and unfortunately, it seems those rumors are coming from within our own leadership. Ethan remained silent, watching as Vaughn played the room. Richard turned his gaze directly to him. It pains me to say this, but our CEO appears to be engaging in activities that could harm the company's reputation. A murmur passed around the table. A few board members nodded, some exchanging quiet glances. Ethan recognized the signs. Vaughn had already spoken to them before this meeting. He had primed them, laid the foundation. Now, all he had to do was tip them over the edge. Ethan cleared his throat. If you're suggesting I'm harming this company, I'd like to hear your reasoning. Richard gave him a sympathetic smile, the kind designed to appear reasonable while holding a blade underneath. It's not just me. Some of our colleagues have expressed concerns. You've been conducting an independent investigation into internal matters. You've made claims, serious ones, but you haven't presented anything concrete to the board. Ethan didn't look away. I haven't presented anything yet. Richard's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. That's exactly the issue, isn't it? This company is not a playground for personal vendettas. We cannot afford reckless decisions that endanger our stability. He folded his hands. Therefore, I propose a vote to suspend Ethan Carter from his position until we can fully assess whether his actions align with the best interests of this company. Ethan's pulse remained steady, but beneath the calm, a cold anger settled into his chest. Vaughn was making his move, and if he succeeded, Ethan would lose everything: access to company systems, control over operations, and any ability to continue his investigation from the inside. He couldn't allow that to happen. He stood, pressing his hands against the table, his voice even but firm. I want to be absolutely clear about something. I'm not harming this company. I'm protecting it. Richard tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Protecting it from what, exactly? Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough for tension to settle. From internal corruption, from people who believe they can manipulate this company to serve their own interests at the expense of our employees, our reputation, and our long-term future. Some board members shifted in their seats. I have evidence, Ethan continued. I have documents, emails, and footage that prove there has been deliberate misconduct within our leadership. He let his eyes land on Richard for half a second before turning back to the rest of the room. If necessary, I will take everything public. A ripple of unease moved through the board. Vaughn, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. Amused. Then, with an almost lazy motion, He gestured to the man sitting 2 seats down, Nathan Holloway, the company's head of legal. Nathan straightened, unfolding a folder in front of him. His voice was clinical. Mr. Carter, following your recent actions, we conducted a thorough review of our internal systems to assess your claims. We found no evidence of any wrongdoing. Ethan's stomach tightened. That's impossible. Nathan barely blinked. We checked the internal servers. No deleted files. No altered security footage. No record of misconduct by any senior personnel. He folded his hands. If you do, in fact, have evidence, we'd love to see it. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. He knew the truth. He had seen the emails, the video, the data that proved everything. But Vaughn had anticipated this move. He had someone inside IT. Someone who had wiped everything before Ethan could act. Across the room, one board member whispered to another, "If there's no proof, this is just speculation." Ethan could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The vote hadn't even happened yet. And already, Vaughn was winning. Then, just as he was about to speak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Someone inside still has the files. Meet me now." It was from Olivia Reed. Ethan's mind raced. Someone had managed to keep a copy of the evidence before it was erased. If he could get to it before Vaughn shut that door too, he still had a chance. But first, he had to get out of this meeting. Vaughn's voice broke through the moment. "Shall we put it to a vote?" Ethan exhaled, then straightened his jacket. "Actually," he said, his voice controlled, "I think this conversation is premature." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Ethan nodded. "If we're going to discuss my so-called reckless behavior, then it's only fair we examine all the facts." He reached for his phone and pretended to check a message. Then, without missing a beat, he slid it back into his pocket and turned to the board. "Let's reconvene tomorrow. I'll present my case properly. Full transparency." A few members nodded in agreement. Vaughn hesitated, weighing the situation. He wanted Ethan out, but forcing a vote now might seem too aggressive. Finally, Vaughn gave a slow smile. "Very well, tomorrow, then." Ethan gave a polite nod, then walked out of the room without looking back. As soon as he stepped into the hallway, he pulled out his phone and dialed Olivia. "I'm on my way," he said. Ethan Carter drove through the dimly lit streets, his grip firm on the steering wheel. The tension from the boardroom lingered, pressing against his temples like a dull headache. He had dodged Richard Vaughn's first strike, but the real battle was only beginning. Olivia Reed's message had been cryptic. "Urgent. A parking garage on the east side of the city. 3rd level." He pulled in, the low hum of his engine echoing against the concrete. A few cars were scattered throughout, but one stood out, a black sedan parked near the far wall. Olivia stood beside it, arms crossed, eyes sharp in the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. She wasn't alone. A man leaned against the car's hood, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in a dark suit with no tie, his brown hair slightly tousled. Thin-framed glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, and his gaze carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. Ethan stepped out of his car, closing the door with measured control. Olivia met his eyes. "This is Ryan McAllister," she said. "You're going to want to hear what he has to say." Ryan didn't waste time. He opened a laptop sitting on the trunk of the car, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. He clicked through a series of folders before turning it toward Ethan. "I worked in the IT security division of your company," Ryan said, his voice calm but precise. "More specifically, I was assigned to handle data protection for certain high-priority individuals." Ethan's eyes flicked to Olivia. She gave him a slight nod, signaling that she had already vetted him. Ryan tapped the screen. "Before I left, I made copies of certain files, just in case." Ethan leaned in. The screen displayed financial records, wire transfers, invoices, hidden payments, names he recognized: Richard Vaughn, Mark Sullivan, and several other high-level managers. Vaughn had been funneling money into private accounts disguised as consultation fees. Then Ryan pulled up a different set of files. Audio logs. He clicked on one. A grainy, recorded phone call played. Mark Sullivan's voice came through first. "It's handled." She took the payout and signed the NDA. A pause. Then another voice, lower and more commanding. Richard Vaughn. Good. Make sure she disappears quietly. I don't want this coming back. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about covering up misconduct. This was Vaughn making problems vanish. Ryan closed the laptop and folded his arms. There's more. I have the unedited security footage from Vera Lux, before the files were altered in the system. Proof that Mark covered up multiple assaults. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was it, the leverage he needed. But something didn't sit right. Ethan studied Ryan for a long moment. You worked for Vaughn, he said. It wasn't a question. Ryan met his gaze without flinching. I did. Olivia crossed her arms. That's the problem. He's a liability. Ryan let out a breath, as if he had been expecting the pushback. I didn't know what I was protecting at first. I thought I was just another guy in IT, making sure executives didn't get hacked. But then I started seeing patterns. Employees disappearing from the system. Reports vanishing. When I dug deeper, I realized I wasn't protecting a company. I was protecting a machine built to bury people who got in Vaughn's way. Ethan folded his arms. Why help me now? Ryan hesitated, his expression tightening. Because I spent years looking the other way. And I hate what that turned me into. Ethan let the silence stretch. He had been around long enough to know that people rarely switched sides out of guilt alone. But Ryan had given him proof, something no one else had. And right now, that made him useful. Ryan straightened. If you want to take Vaughn down, you need more than just evidence. He controls the narrative. You need to hit him where he doesn't expect it. Ethan nodded slowly. I'm listening. Ryan glanced at Olivia before looking back at Ethan. There's a secondary data server Vaughn doesn't know I had access to. It's off-grid, a failsafe in case of a cyber attack. But I can get in. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And what's in it? Everything, Ryan said. Financial records, deleted employee files, internal reports Vaughn thought were wiped clean. If you get that data, there's no spinning the story. It's over for him. Ethan's mind worked through the implications. If this was real, it was his best shot. But Ryan had been part of Vaughn's system for years. The question wasn't just if he could trust him, it was if Vaughn still had a hold on him. Ryan must have read the doubt on Ethan's face. He let out a small, humorless chuckle. You think I might still be working for him? I think it's a possibility, Ethan said evenly. Ryan smirked, then shook his head. If I was still working for Vaughn, you wouldn't be standing here. You'd be in a car trunk headed somewhere no one would find you. Ethan didn't blink. Good to know. Ryan stepped closer, his voice lowering. This isn't just about taking Vaughn down. If you go after him, he's going to come for you harder than before. You need to be sure. Ethan let out a slow breath. He had known from the start that this fight would demand everything. That it wouldn't end cleanly. I've come too far to turn back now, he said. Ryan nodded. Then let's get to work. Ryan McAllister's fingers hovered over his keyboard, the glow from the screen casting sharp shadows on his face. His eyes flicked across lines of code, decrypting layers of security with practiced ease. Ethan Carter stood behind him, arms crossed, watching as the digital walls of his own company slowly began to crack open. This won't be easy, Ryan muttered. Vaughn tightened security after the files were erased. We need direct access to the company's internal network. But that's locked behind multiple firewalls. Ethan already knew what that meant. Vaughn wasn't just covering his tracks, he had buried them under so many layers of encryption that even getting close would trigger alarms. Ryan exhaled, drumming his fingers against the desk. There's one way in, but we need someone with administrative clearance. Someone inside. Ethan nodded slowly. David Langston. David Langston had been a member of the board for over a decade. He wasn't a man easily swayed. But he wasn't loyal to Vaughn either. He valued stability, tradition. That was the leverage Ethan needed. The meeting took place at a private golf club, Langston's preferred retreat from corporate politics. Ethan found him at the driving range, lining up a shot. Langston didn't turn when he spoke. I assume this isn't just a social visit, he said, adjusting his grip on the club. Ethan watched as the ball launched into the open field. I need your help. Langston lowered his club, finally looking at him. Help with what, exactly? Ethan kept his voice steady. Vaughn is manipulating the company. He's erasing records, controlling the board, silencing people who don't fall in line. If we don't act now, he'll own everything. Langston studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed. You're asking me to go against Richard Vaughn. That's not a small request. Ethan stepped closer. I'm asking you to help save this company before it turns into something none of us recognize. Langston tapped his club against the ground, lost in thought. And if I help you, what happens next? Ethan didn't hesitate. We take back control. We expose Vaughn for what he is. Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. You'll have my access. But if this blows up, we never had this conversation. Ethan gave him a firm nod. Understood. That night, back at the company's headquarters, Ryan sat in the dimly lit IT room, his laptop connected to the internal network. Langston's credentials granted them access to a restricted database, one that Vaughn had locked down after purging the evidence. Ryan worked quickly, fingers flying across the keyboard. We're in. Files began appearing on the screen, transaction records, internal memos, security logs. Ethan leaned in, scanning the data. This was what they needed. Then, Ryan's expression shifted. Wait, this isn't right. Ethan's stomach tightened. What? Ryan zoomed in on a section of encrypted files. Vaughn didn't just delete the files. He restructured the entire database. The most important documents, financial records, employee complaints, NDAs. They've been encrypted under a secondary layer. Ethan clenched his jaw. Can you crack it? Ryan started typing again, his brow furrowed. I can try, but this isn't basic encryption. It's active security. Someone is monitoring this system in real time. A sudden beep cut through the silence. A warning flashed on the screen. Unauthorized access detected. Ethan's phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. I know what you're doing. Walk away before it's too late. Ryan glanced up at him. Vaughn knows we're here. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. Then we move faster. The cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, and the air in the conference room was thick with anticipation. Richard Vaughn stood at the podium, his expression calm, his voice measured. He exuded confidence, the kind that came from knowing he controlled the narrative. In recent days, he began, our company has been the target of malicious rumors. Certain individuals, disgruntled and desperate, have been spreading baseless allegations in an attempt to tarnish our reputation. The words were carefully chosen. They were not direct accusations, but they were designed to plant a seed of doubt. We take these matters seriously. Vaughn continued, his gaze sweeping the room. But let me be clear, there is no truth to these claims. We will not allow our company to be used as a weapon in someone's personal vendetta. The message was unmistakable. He was pointing straight at Ethan Carter without ever saying his name. Ethan watched the broadcast from his office, jaw clenched. Vaughn was playing the long game, turning the story in his favor before Ethan even had a chance to strike. The media was already shifting the narrative. The headlines were rolling in. Corporate giant under attack. Unfounded accusations or real corruption? Ethan Carter. Hero or master manipulator? He had expected Vaughn to retaliate. He hadn't expected him to move this fast. Ethan picked up his phone. We need to move, he said. 30 minutes later, he was sitting across from Olivia Reed at a quiet bar in Midtown. She had a tablet in front of her, scrolling through the files he had given her. The dim lighting reflected off her glasses, making her expression unreadable. This is strong, she admitted. The financial records alone are enough to raise serious questions. And this video? She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This isn't just negligence, it's deliberate suppression of crimes. Ethan nodded. We release this the wrong way, and Vaughn will spin it against us. Olivia tapped her fingers against the table. So what's the plan? Ethan leaned in. We hit him where he doesn't expect it. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Which is? Ethan's voice was steady. We make him react. 1 hour later, Olivia's article went live. The title was simple, direct, exclusive. The hidden corruption inside Vaughn Enterprises. The details were damning. The unedited security footage, the secret payouts, the emails implicating Mark Sullivan and high-ranking executives. It spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Stockholders were already making calls. Vaughn had spent years crafting an untouchable image. But now, the cracks were showing. And then, just as Ethan expected, Vaughn made his move. Less than an hour after the article dropped, Vaughn called a second press conference. But this time, he wasn't just on the defensive. He was going for the kill. The screen in Ethan's office flickered as Vaughn stepped up to the podium again. His expression was different now, sharper, colder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vaughn began, "I regret to inform you that the so-called whistleblower in this situation is not acting out of integrity, but self-interest." A murmur ran through the press room. Vaughn turned to the large monitor behind him. "Let me show you something." The screen played a grainy video. Ethan frowned. He hadn't seen this before. It was footage of him in a private meeting room with an employee, one of the women who had filed a complaint months ago. But something was off. The audio had been manipulated. In the video, Ethan's voice had been altered just enough to make it sound as though he was pressuring the employee into fabricating a claim against Vaughn's associates. The footage had been edited, cutting out key moments, twisting reality just enough to make it appear damning. Vaughn turned back to the crowd. "This is what's really happening. Mr. Carter is orchestrating a smear campaign, using employees, threatening their careers, to fabricate a scandal that doesn't exist." The reporters erupted in questions. Some skeptical, some alarmed. Ethan's stomach tightened. Vaughn hadn't just prepared for his attack. He had built a counter-narrative so strong that it could turn public perception against him in a matter of minutes. Ethan's phone buzzed. A message from Ryan McAllister. "I have something. The last file. This changes everything." Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, heart pounding. He had one last shot to turn this around. This wasn't just about Vaughn anymore. There was something bigger lurking beneath the surface. And now, he was about to find out what it was. Ethan Carter sat at his desk, the glow from his laptop screen reflecting in his sharp eyes. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before finally clicking on the newly recovered file. The moment he opened it, his breath hitched. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. This was the kind of information that could bring Richard Vaughn to his knees. A financial contract, covert transactions between Vaughn and high-ranking company officials, disguised under consulting fees and shell companies, payments linked directly to individuals involved in past cover-ups, a string of encrypted messages, Vaughn giving direct orders to Mark Sullivan, instructing him to silence employees who spoke out about harassment. The messages didn't just confirm Vaughn's knowledge, they proved he had orchestrated the suppression. And then, the most damning piece, a voice recording. Ethan clicked play. At first, the audio was grainy, but as it stabilized, Vaughn's voice came through, clear and calculated. "If Carter keeps pushing, we'll make sure he disappears from this company, one way or another." The response came from another voice, distorted and masked. "And if that doesn't work, then we take more extreme measures." Ethan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. Vaughn wasn't just trying to force him out, he was prepared to go further. Much further. Ethan knew he couldn't rush this. Vaughn had already twisted the media narrative once. If he released the recording prematurely, Vaughn would claim it was manipulated, just like he had done before. This had to be strategic. He gathered his allies, Olivia Reed, David Langston, and Ryan McAllister, in a private office downtown. The air was thick with tension. "This is our best shot," Ethan said, playing the recording. "Vaughn isn't just corrupt, he's dangerous." Langston exhaled sharply. "If this gets out, there's no coming back for him." Ryan frowned. "There's still the problem of who Vaughn was talking to. If we can't prove that, he'll claim it was taken out of context." Ethan nodded. "That's why we're not releasing this yet." Olivia leaned forward. "So what's the play?" Ethan outlined his plan. "First, create internal pressure. Get the board to question Vaughn's leadership. Make them doubt him before this evidence even comes out. Second, force Vaughn into the spotlight. If they could make him react publicly, he might slip. And finally, release the evidence when he least expected it, in a setting where he couldn't control the response." Langston hesitated. "And what if he sees this coming?" Ethan met his gaze. "Then we make sure he doesn't have time to stop it." The next morning, Langston called an emergency board meeting. Vaughn arrived late, his suit crisp, his demeanor unshaken, but Ethan could see it, the slight tension in his shoulders. the way his fingers tapped subtly against the table. Langston stood. We have reason to believe that there have been irregularities in company operations. Vaughn gave a small smirk. Irregularities? Langston nodded toward Ethan. Mr. Carter has presented concerning evidence. Ethan remained seated, his voice calm. A recording has surfaced. It suggests that key executives may have taken extreme measures to remove perceived threats. A murmur spread through the boardroom. Vaughn kept his expression neutral, but Ethan noticed the way his jaw tightened. You have a recording? Vaughn asked smoothly. I'd love to hear it. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm sure you would, but I prefer to present it at the right time. Vaughn's smirk faded slightly. Sounds convenient. One of the other board members, a woman named Margaret Holloway, leaned forward. If there's merit to these claims, we need to investigate. Another executive, Gerald Foster, nodded. If there's nothing to hide, then transparency shouldn't be an issue. Vaughn's fingers stopped tapping. He was losing ground. But then, just as Ethan thought he had gained control, Vaughn leaned back, exhaling through his nose as if amused. This is a game, Vaughn said, a well-played one, but you're forgetting one thing. The room went silent. Vaughn pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. I just received a message from one of our investors. Seems they've heard about these accusations. He gestured vaguely, and they're not pleased. In fact, they're considering pulling their funding unless we remove any instability in our leadership. Ethan realized what was happening before Vaughn even said the words. I propose an immediate vote, Vaughn declared, on whether Ethan Carter remains fit to serve as CEO. The timing was deliberate. Vaughn was forcing a decision before Ethan could release the recording. Langston looked at Ethan, his expression tense. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. You think you're winning? Take one more step, and you'll regret it. No name, no number. But Ethan already knew who it was from. And it meant that Vaughn wasn't working alone. Richard Vaughn stood behind the podium, the bright glare of the cameras making the sweat on his forehead glisten. But his voice was steady, confident. He knew exactly how to play this game. There is a smear campaign underway against me in this company, he announced, his tone measured, almost pitying. It's being led by a man desperate to cling to relevance, Ethan Carter. He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. He has fabricated evidence, twisted facts, and manipulated the media to serve his own interests. But let me be clear, there will be a full internal investigation. And when the truth comes out, it will be undeniable. Some reporters nodded, taking notes. Others exchanged skeptical glances. But Vaughn didn't need to convince everyone. He just needed to plant doubt. Ethan watched the live broadcast from Olivia Reed's office, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He had expected Vaughn to come out swinging. But this wasn't just a counterattack. This was Vaughn setting the stage for his next move. He's buying time, Olivia muttered, eyes locked on the screen. Ethan nodded. And if we give him even an hour, he'll have control of the narrative. They had one shot. The article had to go live, now. Ethan took a deep breath. Do it. Olivia didn't hesitate. She clicked the final confirmation. And within seconds, the story was everywhere. The headline was brutal. The corruption of Richard Vaughn. Leaked evidence reveals cover-ups, bribery, and threats. It was a complete exposé. The leaked financial contracts showing Vaughn funneling money to silence employees. The unedited emails proving that he ordered the suppression of sexual harassment claims. And finally, the full, raw audio file. The internet erupted. Social media exploded. Vaughn's name trended instantly. And within minutes, news outlets picked up the story. Stockholders panicked. Employees started leaking more details, adding fuel to the fire. Vaughn wasn't just under suspicion anymore. He was drowning. Then Ethan's phone rang. Ryan McAllister. But the moment Ethan answered, his stomach dropped. Ryan's voice was shaky, uneven. Ethan, we have a problem. Before Ethan could respond, another voice cut through the line. You really thought he could outplay me? Vaughn's voice was smooth, almost amused. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Where is he? Vaughn chuckled. That depends. If you'd like to see him again, you'll do exactly what I say. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Vaughn had caught Ryan. And if Ryan had been compromised, that meant The files. The raw data. The backups. Everything they hadn't released yet. If Vaughn had Ryan, he might have access to all of it. Olivia stared at him, reading his expression. What happened? Ethan exhaled, his mind racing. Vaughn has Ryan. Her eyes widened. That means he might have the evidence. 2. Ethan had two choices. Wait, try to get Ryan back, but risk Vaughn finding and destroying any remaining files. Or push forward, release everything they had left, and take Vaughn down now. But if they did that, Ryan might not make it out. Olivia met his gaze. If we wait, Vaughn cleans this up. Ethan knew she was right. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then looked at her. Post everything. No turning back now. Ethan Carter stood by the window of Olivia Reed's office, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The weight of his decision pressed against him, but there was no turning back. Do it, he said. Olivia didn't hesitate. She typed the final command and hit send. Within seconds, the article was live. The headline was everywhere. Richard Vaughn's dirty secrets, power manipulation, scandal cover-ups, and a conspiracy to take down the CEO. The world exploded. News stations picked it up within minutes. Social media was in chaos. Hashtags calling for Vaughn's resignation flooded Twitter. Investors panicked. Employees whispered in hallways. But the real damage came when corporate executives, many of whom had remained silent, began distancing themselves from Vaughn. It wasn't just Ethan's word anymore. It was a movement. Richard Vaughn was a man who thrived on control. Losing it was never an option. Hours after the article broke, he called for an emergency press conference. The setting was strategic, his personal office. Polished and pristine, he wanted to appear calm, composed, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of something behind his carefully controlled expression. This, he declared, voice steady, is nothing more than a calculated smear campaign. He let the words settle before continuing. Ethan Carter is a desperate man, willing to destroy this company's legacy for his own gain. I will not stand for it. Then came his final play. I am filing a defamation lawsuit against Ethan Carter and every media outlet that has spread these lies. Gasps echoed in the press room. Reporters scrambled to take notes. But Vaughn wasn't done. I have proof that Carter manipulated evidence, that he coerced employees into fabricating claims. And I promise you, the truth will come out. It was a well-crafted speech. He spoke with confidence, with authority, and for a moment, it almost seemed like he had regained control. Until Ryan McAllister appeared, an hour after Vaughn's press conference. Ryan McAllister sat in front of a live camera at a competing news network. His face was bruised, his shirt wrinkled, but his voice was clear. I worked under Richard Vaughn for years. I know exactly what he's capable of. He held up a flash drive. This contains every document, every hidden transaction, every manipulated security log, everything he's ever covered up. The broadcast went viral instantly. More voices joined in. Former employees stepped forward. Executives who had once feared Vaughn now spoke out. And then came the final blow. A senior shareholder, a man who had once stood by Vaughn, released a public statement. This company cannot move forward with a leader who has repeatedly abused his power. I am calling for an immediate vote to remove Richard Vaughn from the board. By morning, the boardroom was silent. 12 members sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces unreadable. Vaughn sat at the head, his hands clasped, his expression tight. Ethan sat across from him, calm, waiting. The vote began. One by one, hands were raised. 1, 2, 5, 7. Vaughn's fingers drummed against the table. 10, 11. He already knew. The final vote was cast. Richard Vaughn was officially removed from the board. The reign of the most powerful man in the company had come to an end. Vaughn didn't speak as security escorted him from the building. He didn't make eye contact, didn't protest. But Ethan knew, this wasn't over. Men like Vaughn never went down quietly. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that a bigger storm was coming. Richard Vaughn sat in the dimly lit back room of an exclusive private club, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished mahogany table. Across from him sat 3 members of the board, men who had stood by him through countless power struggles. Men who understood that corporate loyalty was often dictated by profit, not principle. "We can still turn this around," Richard said, his voice calm, measured. "Ethan Carter doesn't understand what it takes to run this company. If he takes control, our market position will crumble. Investors will panic. But if we act now, if we present a unified front, we can prevent this disaster before it's too late." His words hung in the air, deliberate and strategic. He wasn't just pleading for support. He was making them an offer. One of the men, Leonard Chase, leaned forward, expression unreadable. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Richard smirked. "A counter-vote." The room fell silent. By morning, the boardroom was filled with tension. Every seat was occupied, every face composed yet alert. This was more than a corporate meeting, it was a battle for the company's future. Ethan Carter sat across from Richard Vaughn, his expression unreadable. He knew Vaughn had spent the night rallying support, knew the man was too calculating to accept defeat without a final play. David Langston, standing at the head of the table, cleared his throat. "We are here today to cast a decisive vote. The question before us: should Richard Vaughn retain his position on this board?" Richard leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. Ethan remained still. 4 in Vaughn's favor, 5 against. Then 6. Vaughn's confident smirk faltered. He had counted on more allies. 8. The room was shifting. Then the door swung open. Sophie Martinez stepped inside, her posture firm despite the weight of the moment. Ethan turned toward her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. Neither had Vaughn. She walked to the center of the room and placed a small digital recorder on the table. "I have something the board needs to hear," she said. A few board members exchanged glances, but Langston nodded for her to continue. Sophie pressed play. A voice crackled through the speakers, Richard Vaughn's unmistakable tone. Crisp and deliberate. "Make sure those reports disappear. Mark, I don't care how you do it. If Carter gets his hands on them, we're all screwed." A sharp inhale filled the room. It was undeniable. For the first time, Vaughn looked shaken. He glanced toward his remaining allies. But their expressions had shifted. The tide had turned. Langston didn't hesitate. "I call for an immediate vote." The hands went up. 10 against Vaughn. 5-4. It was over. Vaughn stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks as if he could still maintain control of the moment. He exhaled through his nose, then turned toward Ethan. "You think you've won?" His voice was low, just above a whisper. "This isn't over." Ethan held his gaze. "It is for you." Security approached to escort Vaughn from the building. The man who had ruled with an iron grip, who had silenced employees and manipulated power, was finally removed. But as Ethan watched Vaughn walk away, he knew the truth. Men like Richard Vaughn didn't just disappear. They regrouped, they rebranded, and they always came back. The boardroom was quieter than usual. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air remained. David Langston sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his fingers intertwined as he looked around at the remaining board members. Some were still processing the events of the past few days, how quickly power had shifted. How a man like Richard Vaughn had been dethroned in front of their eyes. "This company will move forward," Langston announced, his voice calm yet firm. "But before we do, there's one last thing we need to address." He glanced at Ethan Carter, who sat at the far end of the table, expression unreadable. "The investigation into Richard Vaughn." A murmur swept through the room. Everyone knew what this meant. Vaughn wasn't just out of the company, he was under scrutiny. The financial discrepancies, the manipulation, the cover-ups, everything was now on the table. Richard Vaughn hadn't been seen publicly since the vote that removed him from the board. His absence didn't go unnoticed. The media had a field day with his downfall, headline after headline dissecting his fall from grace. Former employees stepped forward, sharing stories of intimidation and coercion. Executives distanced themselves. Investors pulled out. But the real blow came when government agencies started paying attention. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry into financial misconduct. The Department of Justice launched a preliminary investigation into corruption and obstruction of justice. And just when it seemed like Vaughn had nowhere left to run, Olivia Reed called Ethan. "I have a source," she said, her voice tense. "Vaughn is negotiating a deal with the government. Ethan frowned. A deal? If he cooperates, he could avoid prosecution. Olivia continued. He's trying to cut his losses and disappear. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. He had expected Vaughn to fight back, to try and reclaim some semblance of control. But this was worse. If Vaughn escaped legal consequences, what stopped him from resurfacing in another city, under another name, with another scheme? That night, Ethan sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against him. He had won. Vaughn was out. The company was free of his influence. But justice, real justice, hadn't been served. If Vaughn was allowed to walk away, it meant the system was still broken. That power and influence could still buy freedom. Ethan had spent his life believing in accountability. But now, he had to ask himself, how far was he willing to go to ensure it? He turned back to his desk, reached for his phone, and dialed. Olivia, he said, I need you to leak Vaughn's negotiation to the press. There was silence on the other end. Then, a slow exhale. You sure about this? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. If I stop now, he wins. And that was something he couldn't allow. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the charges. Richard Vaughn sat at the defense table, his face devoid of its usual arrogance. The walls that had once protected him, his wealth, his connections, his influence, had crumbled. Ethan Carter watched from the gallery, his expression unreadable. He had seen powerful men escape justice before, had watched them buy their way out of consequences. But not this time. Richard had tried to cut a deal, but with the evidence Ethan had provided to the FBI, there was no way out. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Richard Vaughn, you are hereby charged with financial fraud, corporate corruption, and obstruction of justice. Bail is denied. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The once untouchable mogul would await trial behind bars. As Vaughn was led away, he turned his head slightly toward Ethan. His lips curled into something resembling a smirk. But his eyes, cold and calculating, held a message. This isn't over. Ethan met his gaze but didn't react. He had expected nothing less. With Vaughn gone, the company was left to pick up the pieces. David Langston, now the official chairman of the board, pushed through a series of critical reforms. Employee protections were strengthened. Internal oversight was enforced. The toxic culture that had thrived under Vaughn's leadership was being dismantled piece by piece. For the first time in years, the company wasn't just chasing profits, it was rebuilding trust. Ethan remained CEO. But for him, this was never about power. It was about setting things right. Sophie Martinez, once a victim of the unchecked power within the company, now worked in a safer environment. Policies were rewritten, protections enforced. No one would be forced to endure harassment again. Ryan McAllister, the man who had once played both sides, found himself in a different role. Given a second chance, he now worked within the company's new security division, ensuring that what had happened before would never happen again. And Olivia Reed, the journalist who had helped expose Vaughn's empire of corruption, continued to tell the stories others tried to bury. She was the first to interview Ethan once the dust had settled, making sure the truth was preserved. Late one evening, as Ethan packed up his office, he noticed an envelope on his desk. No stamp, no return address. Inside, a single photograph, his family, taken from a distance, and below it, a message in bold, precise handwriting. You won this battle, but are you sure you've won the war? Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping the note. He had known this wasn't just about Richard Vaughn. There were always others. Men in shadows who had enabled Vaughn, who had let him rise to power, and who were waiting to take his place. The fight wasn't over. He slipped the note into his pocket and turned off the light. For now, at least, he had done what he set out to do. But he would never stop watching. Power can protect, but it can also corrupt. Richard Vaughn thought he was untouchable, until one man decided to stand up. Not just for himself, but for the truth. Ethan Carter didn't just expose a scandal, he changed a system that had been broken for too long. But here's the real question. How many Vaughns are still out there, hiding behind wealth and influence? And how many Ethans are willing to fight back? If you believe in justice, in holding the powerful accountable, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths. Because sometimes, the biggest stories are the ones they don't want you to hear.